You're listening to the Raising Family Podcast with your hosts, David Steele and Linda Hill. Brought to you by thefamilyproclamation.org.
Hello and welcome to the Raising Family Podcast. I'm your host, David Steele, along with co-host Linda Hill. And today we are discussing paragraph 4 of the Family Proclamation, the first part of the paragraph. And we are blessed to have with us Logan Wilkes. And maybe I'll just give a brief introduction to Logan. And then if he has to add anything to that, he's welcome to, about his family, about his situation, where he's at in life. And then we'll just kind of dive into asking him some questions. So Logan lives here in Utah, and he is currently the CEO of a company called Truss. And I believe they enable business companies to create networks, network with each other, expand, really kind of a entrepreneurial boost type of a company. And I read a little bit about it, and it looks super intriguing and cool. So maybe he'll give us a line or two about that. Basically, he's an incredible businessman and an incredible father. That's why he's on today, because he's awesome. So, Logan, I'm going to read this first couple sentences and then maybe just give a little bit about yourself, where you're at, and then we'll just dive right in. So the paragraph 4 says, the first commandment that God gave to Adam and Eve pertained to their potential for parenthood as husband and wife. We declare that God's commandment for his children to multiply and replenish the earth remains in force. So that's what we're talking about today. So Logan, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we will get into the good stuff.
Awesome. Thank you, David and Linda, for having me here today. We'll just cut to the juice. I think the reason why I'm here today is because I was considered a menace to society for maybe 10 to 15 years, depending on, if you ask my mom or my dad. But I grew up in Portland, Oregon, went to BYU, and then graduated BYU, not married, to my mother's disappointment. And then found a job and loved it, and eventually got married just before my 32nd birthday. So I had the joy of being kicked out of a singles ward.
I was going to say, that's that age.
I got the awkward letter from the second counselor.
What is that age?
Is 31.
It's 31.
It's depending on how lax with the rules your bishop is, right?
Okay.
And kind of what part of the country you live in.
Right.
But got married to an amazing woman. Her name is Ashley. And then 2 years later, had our first boy, Jack. And
fun.
then just about almost 4 months ago, had our second boy, Max.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Wow, that's
How
awesome.
fun.
Yeah, they're awesome.
Yeah, that's exciting for me. I am going to become a father in like a week.
Yeah. So he's going to have a lot of questions for you over there.
Yeah.
I might have more of that mother questions. You're talking about your parents. I might.
Yeah.
And, I happen to know your mothers.
No, Max is 4 months. There is a sleep regression at 4 months. And so if I fall asleep over here, it's because Max is in the middle of that.
Yeah.
David's napping every day just in preparation, I'm sure,
I
over
really
here.
am, yeah.
Storing up.
No doubt about that. Okay, so with that in mind, maybe let's just talk first about those 3 words, the potential for parenthood.
Okay.
Maybe just what, when that is said, the potential for parenthood, what does that bring to your mind, and kind of how do you see yourself fitting into that phrase?
Oh, the potential for parenthood. A lot of that would depend on kind of what stage of life am I reading that statement. Mm-hmm. That statement has changed a lot for me, almost in recent history. Right now, my current state with now a second child, it means something different than it just did 6 months ago, right, David? When I was in your shoes, the potential for parenthood, I threw everything into Jack. Mm-hmm. And he is and was my buddy. We did everything together. And now the biggest realization for me is I have to do that with Max too. Not just with Jack.
Right.
It's a lot easier to do with Jack because I can throw him on my back and we can go on a hike. But with Max now, he just lays there. And so, how do I develop that same type of, how do I be a father to Max as well? Because when it was just just Jack, it was easy to read Jack a story. But now when it's Max, it's like, oh, Ashley, you take care of Max. I'll go play with Jack. And so absolutely. So right now, how it hits me is, okay, how do I do this with Max as I did with Jack, and splitting that? You know, figured like, how do you split love?
And did you have that fear? I remember as a mother expecting my second child, thinking, how am I ever going to love another child as much as I love this first?
Absolutely.
And you feel that and then you learn that you don't divide love. You multiply.
It just grows and multiplies.
Do you have those fears? I mean,
absolutely, I did and still do almost, right? Because as a dad, right, there's this instant bond there will be, David, with your wife, because she carried him or her for 9 months and then is the main provider, right? Your support for a long time. And a lot of those, as a dad, for me, my relationship with Jack and Max grew as we were able to do things together. And so, there has to be conscious effort put into that with Max, because we're not necessarily at a stage where we can do things yet together. I mean, we do, but he sleeps in his car seat. But
takes him a while to get that personality that gives back to you.
And what's been easier for me, and Max, it's stupid, but Max smiled earlier than Jack. Right. And so there I'm like, oh, a reaction, something to go off of. And so it's almost been easier with some areas with Max, but with Jack, he was the only one. And so that was a lot easier there.
Yeah. And so earlier you said, I think your exact words were that you put everything into your son, Jack. You kind of laid it all out on the line. And maybe just talk about that. Talk about, how being intentional has affected parenthood and how that kind of plays into your marriage as well as being a father.
Yeah. So I'll back up a little bit and maybe rephrase something and saying, like, the core of everything is my love for Ashley. The core of everything is my relationship with Ashley. So, Dave, you're about ready to have a child of your own, right? Your wife's first job for this next weeks is to keep the kid alive. Your job is to keep your wife alive. Right. And then all of a sudden, like from there, you will then your love for your wife will be like, I need to give her a break. I'm going to take this kid away. Not to take the kid away, but like, I'm going to go take the kid so she can have a break. Mm-hmm. The core of everything for me really started with that love for Ashley. And then I started taking Jack places to give her a break. I'm like, oh, this is fun. And then that's what helped me really start to ignite that relationship with Jack and now Max. Mm. But it started with, okay, what do I do for Ashley? I'll give her a break. And then we started to go do things together. Mm. And, I've started going on a hike every Saturday morning with Jack because she was pregnant with Max. And then all of a sudden I developed these awesome relationships with Jack. Mm. And now I want to keep doing it because I love my little boy, and I can't wait for Max to be old enough for me to do it with both of them. But the core of what initiated it all was the love and the connection with Ashley, which then helped me develop real relationships with my sons.
Wow.
That is fantastic. And so tell us about your 20s. I mean, because I'm curious, you're talking about this, how it's changed recently, but when you were dating, did you ever even think about your potential for parenthood? Is that something that you thought of much?
I did. I dated a lot and often, and so I guess it was always there. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't this huge sense of urgency there in my 20s to get married. There was a desire. Maybe depending on what stage of life, the desire was greater or smaller. Right. But there honestly wasn't a real sense of urgency until I turned 30, to be honest with you.
You had 1 year left in the singles ward and you thought,
it's time.
The clock was ticking.
Honestly, I moved to San Diego in 2014, right when I turned 30. And I remember my first Sunday there in the singles ward, I came home and I probably cried. And I was like, what have I done? Because in Utah, there were, this sounds terrible, but as a 28, 29, 30-year-old single LDS guy going to singles wards, there wasn't a lack of options. And that was mainly because I was still going to church and was male. Then I went to San Diego, and those options weren't as many.
Right.
And I was like, well, what have I done? And I think maybe the scarcity is what maybe kicked my butt into gear a little bit, and maybe increased a sense of urgency. Was maybe that law of scarcity is what kind of changed for me.
Well, and I think the dating culture is very different in Utah. I know I have single adult
100%.
children, and it's also different than it was for me 30 plus years ago, right? For your parents and my parents' age. It's so different.
Completely different. And for me, when I moved to San Diego, not just did the dating scene change, but I really, like, my work environment changed. Like, there was, here in Utah, one of the main reasons why I took the job to transfer to San Diego was I knew it would push me out of my comfort zone, personally, professionally, spiritually, in every area of my life. It was new. And I think that is what made me realize to the core what is most important and reevaluate that, and which made that potential for parenthood. I maybe just more self-aware of that, and maybe moved that up on the priority list because everything in my life was new. When I was here in Utah, had the great job, had the great friends, had, dating all of the time. It wasn't as urgent.
Some people say it's almost like, girls, it's like a UTA bus. There's another one coming around the corner. If you can't get, because there's just it was so plentiful. Then maybe it was harder to commit, I guess.
The circumstances were different. The circumstances were different. And life was really good. Life was really, really comfortable. And to be honest, like, in the church, oftentimes I feel like in order to teach principles, we use fear or obligation as a teaching tactic. And I think for a lot of decades, the obligation of going to college, the obligation of getting married and having kids was enough for people, and they just did it. But I think now you have to really tap into not just kind of why, benefits, not just, hey, we don't do this. It's like, well, let's talk about why we do this.
Oh, okay.
And oftentimes when people talk about marriage and kids, they talk about all the bad stuff and then end a monologue of how rough their life is with, but it's totally worth it.
Oh, so not a very good marketing plan. Is that what you're saying?
We're terrible in marketing marriage. We either market marriage and children through obligation or through, it's what you do. And I'm like, well, what you did is also wake up at 5 a.m. and go milk cows. I don't want to do that.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. And it is really interesting talking about the why. And I think maybe just before we go further on that point, we were looking at some statistics, the statistics of like the median age at first marriage in the United States. I know you probably, said you felt kind of like the anomaly. The scarcity probably showed that, oh man, everybody's married except for me, right? Kind of a thing. But looking at these, it's just really interesting. So they didn't have a ton of data until 1947, but in 1947, the median age of first marriage was 23. 1948 was 23, and then through the rest of the 50s and 60s, it was 22 years old. 22, and then in the 70s, it went to 24, 80s went to 25, 90s went to 26, the early 2000s went to 27, 2010s went to 28 and 29, and then 2020, it just hit 30 and a half years of age is the median for first marriage.
Okay, so my husband is a YSA bishop outside of Utah. and I know that when he was called to this position at first, we called all of our kids like, okay, so tell us what not to do. Because, I certainly have had different advice from people like, hey, don't do this, don't say this. And immediately our kids had plenty of advice, so what do we do? I'm curious. The question I'm going to ask you is, what can we do to make that more appealing? Because I know that it can come across that that's the only thing that we're teaching, when of course, I think the number one thing in the gospel is teaching a love for our Savior, right? And a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I think that's definitely what you want to focus on. But how do you handle this other stuff we're talking about?
I think the first thing I'd say is relax. Like, are they good people? Right? Yeah. Like in celebrate like what is going well, celebrate what's going like good in their life. Validate what they are doing rather than every time people talk to them pointing out what's not happening, right? Like there is nothing worse than a single person going back to the family ward in the questions that people would ask you, like, oh, why aren't you married? Why aren't you this? Why? And they think they're being funny, and they think that's like most people. When they start a conversation with someone that's single and is above the age where they think they should be married, that's the first thing they ask.
Right.
And it also doesn't change, right? And then you get married, and then they're like, oh, well, they should start having kids. Right. Like, there was one time in church, you guys are good because I'm going to share like incredibly vulnerable story, like right out of the gate. I was in church walking down the halls, and somebody asked me, hey, you've been married a year. Like, why aren't you having a baby?
Oh. Wow.
Happens all the time. Ashley was home having a miscarriage at the same time.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Like, I was a member of the bishopric, and that's why I was there that day. If I wasn't a member of the bishopric, I might have hit another member of my ward in the halls of the church. That is a dramatic story, but we also don't know what's going on. People's individual lives these days are very complicated. And maybe I'm biased, but far more complicated than maybe they were in 1940 or in 1960 or in 1970. And so the first thing I would say is just relax. Like, we sometimes get so fixated on, well, at this age I do this, and at 8 I get baptized, at 12 I get the priesthood, at 19 I go on a mission, at 23 I get married, and then at 24 I have a kid. Like, we're so fixated on a certain path. I don't think Christ or Heavenly Father really care necessarily about the ages. They just care that we do it. And oftentimes I think with maybe like the way we're raised in today's world and today's society is like the different pressures that we have on kids. And we learn maybe different skill sets differently. Like, for example, right? Like, people are worried about ACT and SAT prep, like in middle school now, or like in high school. And so you have all these pressures where instead of like being roughed up on the playground, they're sitting inside by themselves, like studying for a test. And what I mean by that is they're maybe at 21 or 23, we're not as ready to get married as we were decades ago, because we haven't learned certain things about life, about each other, about ourselves.
Well, yeah, they've talked about this extended adolescence, and that's one of the things with sort of this millennial generation too, is because there's so much helicopter parenting to the point where all of a sudden at 18, they're not really fully an adult because we have micromanaged them to death to the point 100%. Where they haven't been able to make enough decisions and do some of these things. And so there is sort of this worry of extended adolescence. And I can see what you're saying there.
Yeah.
Right. Because there's a lot of skills and things that they may have that we didn't have. However.
Oh yeah. I mean, just the pressure,
emotional
like,
maturity.
Absolutely. Right. You're told from a young age, like, hey, if you screw up your grades your freshman year, you're going to miss out on opportunities later on in life. Right. And just the pressure. It's like, oh, if you pick the wrong person to get married, like, you're not going to like, that's why I just say relax. Right. And like, it will come, it will happen. Right. Everybody's potential is different. We try to put potential in a box and measure it by metrics of age, of stage of life. But everybody's potential is beautiful and is different.
I appreciate that. And so what would you say then are some positive messages to help young people understand, now that you are this dad and you're talking about how great it is with your kids and the things that you're learning, what are some things that you would say to this? Because I do see a lot more anxiety and hesitancy. And how do we get them to understand that there's still this life to be lived married? Because I've seen it sometimes even in my own children. You know, they love to travel. I got a job with the airlines a while back, so my kids really had some opportunities to travel more so than they might have otherwise. And then there's this sort of almost, oh, I got to see all these places before I get married and maybe can't do all these things. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. I think I'd only been out of the country one time. before I ever did that. And then there was probably a good 20 years of marriage before now my husband and I travel all the time. But almost this idea that you have to get all this stuff in before you get married. What would you say to that mentality? Because I mean, I do see my kids, some very happily single, and I love to see that they are out there. They're rock climbing and they're camping and they're doing a lot of really fun things. But there also can be an addiction to this fun, thinking that it's going to end or something when you get married. So what would you say to that?
Well, yeah, when everybody talks about like when the sales pitch for marriage is like, wow, he does this or she does that. Oh, but it's totally worth it. Like,
but
right.
Like, why get married? Like, okay. I'm honestly shocked that as many people get married today as they do, inside or outside the church, by the way that we talk about marriage or even portray it. Like, I mean, let's not even talk about how, the media or social media or, entertainment portrays marriage. The thing for me that I would focus on is people's individual potential and individual growth. I didn't have some awakening moment where I was like, I have to get married now. It was an investment in me realizing and pushing myself to increase my own potential, right? I was at a stage of life where like my world got shaken up when I moved to San Diego. Tons of stress, lots of loneliness. And all of a sudden I realized like, hey, like I got into shape. Like I got a personal trainer. I got into shape. I ate better. And then all of a sudden, like I started to read more. I started to go to the temple more. And all of a sudden my own personal progress, my own personal potential, I pushed myself into the motivation of like, hey, this is actually something that I want to do. And it was the personal progress. It wasn't someone coming to me and being like, hey, you know what? Marriage is really good. And here's the sales pitch for it. And you're missing out on things. Yeah. If you want to push somebody farther away from the idea of marriage or fatherhood or parenthood, tell them they're missing out on something. And they're like, oh, I'll show you. Watch, I'll go to Iceland. You think I'm missing out on something? Watch what I can go do. But it was my own decision for betterment. And so if I were talking with people, I wouldn't even bring up marriage. I wouldn't even bring up parenthood. I would bring up, okay, where are you at and where do you want to go? And let's improve you. Because I believe as some people improves themselves, and they believe the core principles and of the gospel, and that is what they want to do, they will have a natural inclination to better themselves, to draw themselves closer to Heavenly Father, to make themselves a better person. And when the time is right, they'll discover that on their own. And so I think too often we want to preach at people the importance of marriage, the importance of marriage, the importance of fatherhood, of parenthood, when it's really, I believe, people's individual journeys we should be focused on, and their individuals as their potential as an individual, which then will lead them to those amazing blessings.
Wow.
So you're saying that that's the best way to transition from being happily single.
Relax, back off, and focus on them. Like, it's really that simple.
Okay.
And maybe I'm just curious about this, and hopefully this doesn't come off as too preachy to anybody listening, that this may be like leading the party life right now. But how has your view of, becoming a father changed since actually becoming a father? You know what I mean? I'm just curious because I'm about to have a child. and sometimes I think those things. I'm like, man, am I ever going to make it to Iceland? Do you know what I mean?
There's times and seasons for everything, David. And you're also, it's far harder and far better than I ever imagined. And I didn't give up as much as I thought I would. But then I also gave up way more than I thought I would. I know that makes no sense.
But that's parenthood.
But that's parenthood. And it's priority, right? The greatest equalizer in this life is time, and what we choose to do with that time, and how we choose to manage that time. Right? Like I remember stages of life where I thought I was just too busy to go to the gym. And now I'm at a stage of life where I realize, well, if I don't go to the gym, I won't have enough energy to be an older dad and do everything that I'm supposed to do. And so it's harder and more beautiful than I thought it would. It's scarier than I thought it would be, and like safer and more fulfilling than I thought it would be.
Oh.
That is fantastic. And I've heard you have some fun little traditions that you're starting. Again, only he's 2 years old, but tell us some of the things that you do, because there's still a lot of people that think, when this kid can actually throw a ball, then I'll be interested, or do something at a certain point. There's some, I think occasionally, especially fathers might think, well, when they can communicate better, that's when they'll jump in. Tell us what you can do even with a 2-year-old. Tell us some of the traditions that you're doing and the things that are creating this relationship.
So I think what's helped me do that earlier, like before I could take him on a golf course or throw a ball with him, it was just it's just a self-awareness of being present and in the moment. Now granted, right, I didn't get married till I was almost 32, kid to 34. Like I'd have a lot of life experiences personally and professionally that had got me to the understanding of the importance of being in the moment. And so I don't want to gloss over that, because that was super important for me. Because if I would have had a kid at a much younger age, I don't know if I would have known that, or if I would have been as aware as the power of, no, you need to do things today. There's no longer waiting for tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So some of the things that we do is, if you ask Jack, hey, what day is it today? He says Saturday, and would say, hey, what do we do on Saturdays? He would scream donuts. We go get donuts every Saturday morning.
That's awesome.
And if you wake him up on a Sunday morning and say, hey, what's for breakfast today? He would say puff up pancakes. We make puff up pancakes every Sunday morning, and we go get donuts every Saturday morning. I like to be on the go. I think one of my biggest fears of marriage was like being tied down. And so honestly, maybe like taking him to do so many things is a selfish excuse for me to just keep being on the go. Like I know if I'm not on the go, I'm not going to be a happy person. And so I take them with me.
They're portable people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are very portable. You have to change your expectations, right, on like what you're going to do and how long you're going to do it. But I mean,
revolve around nap time.
Oreos and treats, right? Keep kids happy for a long time. No, but like it's fun. And just like during the pandemic, right, we'd still go out and we'd have trunk picnics in the back of the car. And it was almost out of a necessity of like, how do we get out of this house? I am not, right? We had a 2-year-old and an 18-month-old during a pandemic. Like the kid was about ready to go nuts.
We all
So
were.
it's like, how do you get him out of the house? And so we were eating out of the back of our cars, and now he likes to have picnics in the back of our cars. We still do it with Chick-fil-A because they don't have, the dining rooms open yet. But yeah.
Well, I love what you're saying about, I think you're striking a wonderful balance between routine, because I've learned with watching my grandchildren, and it's different watching from this perspective of a grandmother because you don't see them as often, but I can see my granddaughter, how she thrives on that routine. They absolutely thrive on that routine. But I also see some parents getting so tied down by the routine that they do get tied down at home. I think you're balancing it very well between having the routine so your kids understand what they can expect, because I think that creates a sense of security. Mm-hmm. Knowing what's coming next and knowing what, there's a sense of confidence there, but you're also introducing these fun, new surprises, because I think that's your job as a parent too, to sort of push your children outside of little comfort zones and introduce these new things to the point where they know that whatever it is you're introducing, they're safe, they're going to be fine. And Dad has something fun planned, that it's going to be a good outcome.
The thing that I want people to take away from this, I don't want everybody listening to be like, okay, to be a good dad, I've got to go I have to be more active with my kid and go get donuts on a Saturday morning. It's more, so through some personal development time early on in life, I realized that kind of my mission or my purpose in life is one of the things that I love to do more than anything is to create experiences that connect people and bring them joy. That's why I loved theater.
I was going to say, that's your whole business, isn't it?
That's what I do for a
right,
living.
That's what you do for a living.
I love creating experiences that bring people joy and connection. And so for me, going on a hike every Saturday morning and then involving my brother-in-law and my father-in-law is natural. And that is what I love to do. And that's why it's easy. I'm not straining myself to then, do something that I naturally don't like to do in order to be close to my kids. I'm doing something I'm naturally like and I'm naturally good at, and I'm bringing them along. And so I think the key takeaway there is is what do you love to do? Like, what are you naturally good at? What are you naturally gifted at? And then involve your family in that. That, I think, is the key takeaway that I would share with you, David, as a new father.
Yeah, that's really good.
Well, and also back to what I had said earlier, I'm with the singles. Like, okay, so you like doing all these things. Guess what? With the family,
You don't have to give it up.
You don't have to give it up. You can still have adventures, and then you have someone to share it with.
But most people that got married early on in life say that you do have to give it up because that's just how they talk about it. I don't know if they realized that was an option, to be candid with you. And so you hear it a lot from people like, oh, you're going to have to give that up. Why? Can I just bring him with me? Like, yeah.
Well, when my son got married, and he was just sort of, he was 24, so maybe on the younger end, but they would talk about how they had friends that got married that all of a sudden would quit doing anything. And it was just so annoying to them. Just wait, we're having fun. They'd have game nights. And I love the way that they still get friends together, and they're constantly trying to have fun. And so I don't know where that disconnect comes, where someone thinks, oh, we're married now, so we need to be serious and boring and not have any fun. That's really not how it is at all. We're just put that message out there because I think marriage is great. And I still remember when I was first married, there were a lot of people like, well, if you can get through that first year, it's a doozy. But if after that, it gets better. And
why would anyone do it if that's what they're told?
Exactly. And I thought that was one of the best
Why would
years
anyone ever do it?
I loved our first year of marriage. We had so much fun. And I just remember thinking, and ever since then, I thought, I'm not going to listen to any of this other stupid advice because these people must not be doing it right. Because this marriage is the best institution to be committed to. Right?
100%. And I go back to one of my original points of that's why I think of someone that's not there yet and someone that you really want to try and get there is to focus on their individual potential in development. It's because, so I had a counselor in a stake presidency once, and I had a calling that I reported to. This was right before I was dating a girl and was considering how serious should this be? Right. And he told me this golden nugget that really helped me out a lot. He says, getting married and having kids is an accelerant. It's not necessarily an accelerant for good. It will accelerate wherever you are at. So if you're at a good spot, guess what? Getting married and having a kid will accelerate it to even better.
Yes.
If you're at a bad spot, having kids and getting married will accelerate it to an even worse spot. And that really meant a lot to me because I was like, oh, they talk about it's like this golden ticket that if you have a kid or get married, things will get better. And that's not true. It will accelerate whatever state of life that you're at. Accelerate it into even better or into even worse. I
have always given that advice, and I'm so grateful to hear you say that because that is what people say, well, if we just get married. No. If we just get married, this will be better. No.
It will accelerate whatever state you're currently in.
Right. Oh, I love that. That is really
cool.
Such sage advice. Thank you for sharing
I feel like I can kind of see that in my own life too. It's kind of like where you're at, and then your spouse just kind of like, it almost feels like you're just moving a little quicker in whatever direction you were headed.
Correct.
Huh. And I think also I'm just curious about this, and we won't hold you very much longer because we know you've got to go pick up your son.
I've got
preschool.
20 minutes. You're good.
But just interesting. And I'm not necessarily talking about the people that are like, I don't want to get married. I don't want to have kids, because there are those types of people. And like you said, if you're like, well, you're missing out on so much, and they're going to be like, well, let me show you.
Yeah.
But I do feel like there will be some people listening to this that really just the only thing keeping them from putting themselves in a position to find a spouse or putting themselves in a position to have a child is just because they're scared, just because of fear. Because I know that before I got married, when I haven't had any kids yet, but I'm about to have one, there really is a ton of fear. And it's even brought in by like our own families, because they're always, even our own families are like, oh yeah, marriage is nuts. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, if my mom's listening to this podcast, she needs to turn this off right now for like the next 90 seconds. No.
So what would you say to them? I mean,
I never
just
felt
scared.
As a single person, especially like in the menace to society age group, you don't realize the time where you realize you are the most single is when you're with your family. Mm-hmm. Other areas of life, you don't necessarily realize that you're single.
Right.
But you go home for Christmas, you realize that you're single. Partly because of pressure from parents, mm-hmm. but also partly because you can feel that you have that potential and that you don't have it.
Right.
And so you're like, so this like overwhelming, like kind of like loneliness hits you across the face. Mm-hmm. And then when like people bring it up, it's just like a smack in the face of what you're already feeling. Right. So for any parents out there, they're wondering like, hey, my kids don't realize this. They feel it. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you, if they're single and they go home, they feel it. Not because, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes that, hey, we're missing out is a good thing, is a good motivator to realize them, hey, there is something more. Mm-hmm. And I would add one more thing to what you said, David. I think a lot of people don't move forward in marriage because of, you said, fear. And I'll also say a lot of people feel like a lack of opportunity. Whether that's real or not, that is something that people feel, and which makes it real, right, for them. And what I would tell to them is to work on yourself. Make yourself as good of a person as you can be. And I would also tell them, you can develop as an individual. You can progress as an individual. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes we're told that like, oh, you won't, like I got told all the time, like, hey, there's this like this extra progression and growth that you will get when you get married. That is true. But the way that it was told to me, I was basically told, you can't have this golden ticket of personal progress or growth until you get married. It's like when we're at church and when the Sunday school teacher's like, for those of you that served a mission will understand this point. It is so stupid. And I cringe every time somebody says that. Mm-hmm. Because did the mission teach you that? Absolutely. Can you learn it outside the mission? 100%. Mm-hmm. Is it harder to learn outside the mission? Yeah. The mission kind of like crams it down your throat whether you want to or not. Right. Right? You can learn those same lessons outside of a mission. Mm-hmm. It's harder. Takes more work, takes more time. And I would liken that up to marriage and kind of your own personal progress. There are things that marriage is going to teach you that you can't learn necessarily outside. Right. But you aren't like missing out on these like amazing blessings or like progression by not being married. Like it's going to be harder, but you can do it. And to not give up on your own personal journey of progression and progress and drawing closer to your Heavenly Father.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and it's important to understand there's worse things in life than being single. And one would be being married for the wrong reasons and being married before you're ready, or being in a miserable marriage. And that's why, you don't do it just to do it, right? You don't get married just to get married.
You want to talk about stages of happiness? Somebody once told me, hey, Logan, you know what's wrong with you? And I'm like, please tell me, everybody else does. It's like the lowest level of happiness is like unhappily married. Mm-hmm. That's why people get divorced. And then you have unhappily single. And then your next up, you have happily single. Then you have happily married.
Oh, I like that.
And they said, you're at stage 3 of happiness, and you're having so much happiness that you don't realize that there's something more. Well, he was truthful. His tactics were, demotivating to something, because I don't believe you should say something like, hey, you're missing out on something. Right. But like a lot of it's just to work on your level of happiness. Mm-hmm. And the happier you get, like the more you're going to want to progress. And the more you're going to want to progress, the more you're willing to sacrifice or lean into vulnerability, which guess what? That's what, getting married and having children requires.
A lot of that. Yes. Wow. You have just given us some wonderful nuggets of wisdom here. As a mother of single children, I'm going to try to be so much better. My kids are listening. They're probably going, yeah, Mom, you listening? You're taking some notes over there. Next time we come home, don't bring this up. But I really appreciate your perspective. And I'm sure David over here,
100%,
almost new dad here,
100%
has gleaned some things.
I'm super excited about it. It'll be good.
Thank you for we know you're very busy, and thank you so much for taking time to come have this wonderful heart to heart with us and letting us ask you some difficult questions and being so candid. That's really, we really appreciate it. And I think that there will be a lot of things that our listeners will get from this discussion.
Yeah, I agree. And I think maybe to end, is there anything else that you want to say about the potential for parenthood, or about parenthood, or about really anything? Just any final words?
Just relax and try to draw closer to the Savior. And if you're doing that, like, things will work out. Maybe not in the timeline that it happened. Like I found an old journal entry when I was at scout camp. And I set all these goals of these stages of life, of like these things that I was going to hit, things that I was going to accomplish. Like none of them happened. I went on a mission, but besides that, like nothing happened that I wrote down or in the time frame that it was supposed to happen.
Right.
My life is far better than what I wrote down in that journal.
Wow. Relax and trust in the Lord.
Yep.
I love that. So thanks so much, Logan, for taking some time. And to end, we'll just read that first sentence again. And anyone listening, we hope you learned something amazing. I know that I did. And we'll read this, and then we will let Logan head off to pick up his son from preschool. So here's the paragraph. The first commandment that God gave to Adam and Eve pertained to their potential for parenthood as husband and wife. We declare that God's commandment for his children to multiply and replenish the earth remains in force. And we're so grateful for Logan for sharing so much with us this morning. We won't know that if you're listening to this, but we do.
Whatever time of day you're listening to.
I don't send my kid to preschool at night.
Interesting preschool. Okay. Thanks so much, Logan.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Raising Family podcast. This episode was produced by Carol Rice. Our research coordinator is Angela Valentine. Audio was edited and mixed by John Wright. The Raising Family podcast is brought to you by thefamilyproclamation.org.